Welcome back, everybody. This is our review for Unit 3. We're looking at the two-dimensional art, media, and techniques, and we started off with drawing. So some of the main purposes or functions that drawing fulfills for most people, historically speaking, for artists, would be from left to right across this screen, the study of anatomy, the study of proportion, or the use of a drawing as a diagram or as a plan. Sometimes drawing can be used, as in the example at the left there, as a quick sketch of an idea that you might come back to later or that you might expand on in a different form. But really the primary function, historically speaking, for most artists, especially the Western tradition, the main function of drawing for the longest time has been to work out your preliminary plan or study or composition for a work that's going to be completed in another media, primarily in painting, but sculptors also often would sketch ideas, draw them out before executing those final pieces in whatever sculptural form they were going to use. The term for a drawing that is a plan at the scale that the painting is intended to be, that has the primary contour, outlines, and details that the artist wants to include, is called a cartoon. And this diagram does kind of combine a multitude of different steps as if they could all happen simultaneously, which they couldn't. But you see at the far right the assistants applying the fresh plaster. Once that plaster has dried somewhat in this box here in red, you see the cartoon being applied to the plaster. You can see that the cartoon drawing has holes pierced through along the main outlines and contours, and the charcoal is being passed through those holes by slapping a bag of charcoal against the drawing in a technique called pouncing. You see the painter here working on the painting in fresco on the plaster before it completely dries. So again, these wouldn't all be happening simultaneously, but you get the basic steps. Apply the plaster, transfer the cartoon, complete the painting. The painting technique of fresco, we talked about two different approaches to it. In more arid climates like ancient Egypt, people painted directly onto dry plaster in a technique the Italians call secco fresco, or dry fresco. But the technique being illustrated here, used throughout the High Renaissance and throughout Europe, is the wet plaster or buon fresco technique. We looked at a bunch of different drawing materials. We looked at two major types of what we'll call dry media. The left-hand shot there shows you different types of charcoal, and on the right you see different types of graphite. Charcoal is essentially superheated wood. It can either be in a more raw state, like the examples toward the bottom, or it can be contained in pencil form. The top two examples are types of charcoal pencil. The square piece that's been subjected to pressure is your compressed charcoal, and the round cylindrical form, very light and unable to make very dark marks, is your vine or willow charcoal. The graphite pencils are marked with letter and number designations. H is for your hard pencils, based on the French word haute, which also implies the English word high. That would be our high key values. So your high or haute pencils, your 8H pencils, are very hard, leaving very light marks. Your B range pencils stand for bas, which means low. The low range, of course, is your dark values. So the B range pencils are the softer pencils, leaving dark marks. H, hard, light; B, soft, dark. We looked at ways of making value scales. We looked, of course, at hatching and cross-hatching, blending or smudging with graphite and or charcoal. And you can see also the use of wet media for drawing. In this case, the diluted drawing ink creates what we call ink washes. So the more water you have relative to ink, the lighter the value is going to be, and you can see value scales there. When we looked at painting, we looked at several different steps to get ready for creating a painting. And the first step is to decide whether you're going to work on a flexible or a rigid support. Now, the rigid support's the traditional one. Painting for centuries was done on wooden panels and on walls, caves, or walls of buildings. Canvas is a relatively new-ish invention, and take that with a grain of salt. I mean, it's been done for literally over 600 years at this point, but relative to the whole span of the history of human art making, flexible support canvas is a little bit new. Of course, it has some advantages. It's lighter than the same size of a painting made on a wooden panel. It doesn't have wood grain, so it's unlikely to crack or warp or split. In either case, whether you're working with a rigid support or a flexible support, the traditional first step after selecting the support would be to seal the surface with what we call a size, S-I-Z-E, which in this case has nothing to do with the dimensions of the piece. The size is a glue which seals the surface to prevent it from being damaged by any corrosive materials in the paint. After the size is applied, we would then apply the ground, what we might call the primer coat, which is traditionally white. It is usually a mixture of paint and plaster. We have a material that we use currently that is an acrylic paint. We call it gesso. Is the same as the traditional name we would have used centuries ago, but the acrylic gesso can do the job of both the size and the ground. You see an example of masonite panels there as our rigid supports, a little close-up of the weave of some canvas for a flexible support, and you can see the technique of stretching the canvas at the lower right. The traditional size that we used to seal the support, believe it or not, you can get this material is called rabbit skin glue, and it is exactly what it says. When it is mixed with water, boiled, it becomes a clear, transparent liquid that can be painted onto the surface to seal it. But of course, the acrylic gesso takes the place of that traditional size. It is still applied in more than one layer in alternating strokes. So the first coat might be all in horizontal strokes. The next coat could be in vertical strokes. The purpose of the ground is twofold. It provides another layer of a barrier between your paint and your support, but it also creates a white surface to paint on so that the colors are at their brightest and that they're most intense. If you were to paint the same color onto the raw canvas, the color wouldn't be as bright or as intense because that surface wouldn't have that brilliant white reflection underneath it. The types of paints, the way that these questions show up on the test is very much based on essentially matching and memorizing keywords and matching key terms here. So paint is made from pigment. The pigment is the colored powder, the ground material that gives the paint the color. It is usually a mineral or a natural occurring substance in the world. We have synthetic substitutes for a lot of pigments. What determines the paint type, though, is not the pigment itself. I could take the same red pigment that you see on the screen here, and I could make watercolor with it, or I could make oil paint, or I could make acrylic. What you mix the pigment with is what determines the type of paint. And what the main ingredient that you're mixing the pigment into is called the binder. The binder does the job of making the pigment particles stick to each other and stick to your support. So the types of paint that we looked at them in historical evolution from the earliest used paints to the more contemporary paints. We looked early at the examples of beeswax-based paints. The paint type is encaustic. The binder is beeswax. We then looked at tempera paint. The binder for tempera paint is egg yolk. The binder for oil paint is linseed oil. Gum arabic is the binder for two types of water-based paint, watercolor and gouache. The difference between them is that watercolor is transparent. You can see through it to the surface underneath. but gouache has, in addition to the gum arabic, has chalk added to it to make it opaque. So it looks a little bit more like what you might be familiar with from a craft store being sold as poster paint. The synthetic resin is the binder for acrylic paints, and those are the most new kids on the block, so to speak. We've had acrylic paints available for use in fine art since the late 40s, 1950s. The solvent is sort of the opposite of the binder. The solvent is what dissolves the paint. It's mainly used for cleaning brushes and cleaning up. The solvent for most paints is what we call in chemistry class the universal solvent, water. The solvent for egg tempera, watercolor, gouache, acrylic, all of those, the solvent is water. The solvent for oil paint is turpentine. And technically the solvent for encaustic heat, because the beeswax, of course, hardens when it cools. So to get it to be liquid, if you wanted to remove it or clean it out of a brush, you'd have to heat it up if it had cooled. Tempera painting is perhaps one of the most interesting forms to look at in terms of how it is done. The yolk of an egg can be separated, of course, from the white, and the membrane around the yolk can be pinched and then pierced so that only the yellow liquid pours out of it, and then that can be mixed with pigment, which will then dry very rapidly. So you have to paint fairly quickly, and it's best to do tempera on a rigid support. But when it dries clear, leaving that luminous quality of the pigment. Oil painting is perhaps the most versatile of the paint techniques that we could look at. Oil paint can be applied either in thin layers or in thick layers. So we talk about applying thin glazes. That would be oil paint that's mixed with a little bit of solvent, a little bit of turpentine, but much more binder, adding more linseed oil to it to stretch it out and make it transparent. Or we could apply the paint very heavily, as in the example at the far right. You can see the texture of the strokes of the brush and the palette knife. That would be called impasto, painting with a thick texture. The examples at the left show you the idea of applying colors in glazes on top of layers that have been painted previously. The example at the very bottom shows the application of skin tone on top of a gray scale or grisaille painting that shows you the highlights and shadows. The painting is created essentially as a monochromatic in black, white, gray, and then the color is glazed on top of that in successive layers. We also looked at printmaking techniques, and again, with the questions on the test, it's really important to look for certain keywords with these techniques to match the name of the technique to a tool or to a specific aspect about how the technique is created. In relief printing, as in the example that we see right here, sort of in the middle, bottom middle of the screen, in relief printing, we cut away, we cut into the surface everything that we intend to be white, assuming that we're printing black ink on white paper. The raised up areas, the uncut areas, would carry the ink and would print to the paper. Relief then is completely opposite to the intaglio category of techniques. The intaglio techniques are those in which we take usually copper plate, although we could substitute other types. We often use plexiglass plates for training in printmaking level 1. We use the plate and we scratch into it where we want the details or lines to be, and then we apply ink to the whole surface and wipe the ink off again, and that drives the grooves that we've made with our tools. So intaglio is the complete reverse of relief. In relief, the area that is cut prints as white. In intaglio, the area that is cut prints as black. We also want to think about why we do printmaking. Printmaking is an opportunity to create a work of art, usually at a slightly smaller scale than a full-scale painting that would be the size of an altarpiece or a ceiling painting like the Sistine Chapel, obviously. The idea of printmaking, though, is that you create the original image, what we call the matrix, on your plate, whatever that is, whether it's wood or linoleum or copper, you ink the plate and then print it to paper. And so you're creating multiple copies, each of which are considered original artworks, and they're signed and numbered as such. And that's what you're seeing here. This is a piece by Picasso. It is signed and numbered. There's the number designation in that corner, and I've blown it up here for you. It looks like a fraction. So the top number tells you which of the impressions of the prints you're looking at, and the number at the bottom tells you how many prints were made in that edition. So if you've heard the term limited edition, reference to anything that people might collect, that's what they mean. They mean that there's a set number and then there's a limited number available. And so the edition number kind of helps you to tell that you have an official signed and numbered print from an edition from a professional printmaker. The print process involves what we call proofing, and in this process we will sometimes pause in the development of the image. We'll apply ink and print the plate to paper just so that we can see what the progress looks like. So here you can see 3 that have been made while this artist has been working on this intaglio design. So you can see the image is more developed in this proof here at the end. Once we get the print the way we want it to look, we'll make one on good paper, on the same paper the rest of the edition will be made on, and we'll designate then with either the letters AP, or sometimes people will write out the full words artist's proof. That print is usually kept by the artist. It's not included in the edition numbering, and it is the standard that all of the other prints in that edition need to look like. The AP essentially becomes like the master copy. This is the one that is the standard that all of the other ones must equal. In the relief techniques, the 2 main techniques that we talked about were woodcut and linoleum cut, both of which involve the use of gouge tools to cut away what's white. The several slides are going to show you tools that relate to the intaglio techniques. Intaglio, again, is the opposite of relief. In this case, where we cut is where the ink will be held in the plate. So the cross section you're seeing at the top is a dry point plate. The dry point needle is the least sophisticated of all the tools. It's really just a cylinder of metal that comes to a really sharp point. You draw with it the same way that you would draw on a piece of paper. You are making linear marks, so you can do outlines, contours, hatching, cross-hatching. But with the dry point tool, you're not only scratching a line into the plate, you're also raising a little bit material of the plate to the side. We call that the burr, and the burr actually helps to hold the ink. So if you look really closely at a dry point under a magnifying glass or really close up, you'll notice that the lines look a little bit more like the kind of scratchy lines that pencils make on rougher paper, not quite as even and uniform. They have skips and they waver in terms of the width and thinness of the line. You can kind of see that here. If you look at print here by Mary Cassatt from a distance, it looks like a pen and ink drawing, but the closer you get to it, you can see that those lines are a little scratchy. They look a little bit more behaves on a rougher paper. So this is one of Cassatt's dry points. The tool that's used to make engravings is called the engraving burin. And with this tool, the lines that are incised into the plate are not raising a burr, and the lines stay very, very uniform in their thickness. You see here at the left the full image of a print by Albrecht Dürer. If we zoom in close on it, you can see how all the value that you detect there is actually made from hatching and cross-hatching. And when you look really closely at the lines, you can see that they are, in fact, very uniform. They look much more like the way a pen behaves on smooth paper. So that's the difference between dry point and engraving. One of the more complicated techniques is the mezzotint, which literally means middle value. The mezzotint is a technique in which we rough up the surface of the plate, has to be copper. You see that tool, the rocker, being used here, and it's called the rocker because, of course, it rocks back and forth on this curve. And you can even see a little bit in the teeth, the tines of the rocker poking out. Those little teeth are going to cut burrs into the copper plate. And we rock the plate in 8 different directions, the whole entire surface, so that if it were inked and printed, it would print a solid black rectangle. In order to create the image, we use the tool at the bottom, the burnisher, and you can see an artist here smoothing out some of the burrs to create areas that would be of a lighter value all the way down to white. And so we can create an image like what you see on the left by the artist Carol Wax, which gives you a full range of values and soft transitions, gradients from light to dark. That's all possible with the mezzotint technique. It does look a little bit like this where we make the whole paper dark and then use an eraser to erase out the highlights. Most mezzotints will have a very dark foreground and background with intense highlight on the subject. The acid techniques in intaglio include etching. So with etching, we take our copper plate, we coat the copper with a substance we call the ground. It is resistant to the effect of the acid, and we scratch through the ground, not really into the metal at all, just through the ground, using the tool that you see here. This tool is known as a whistler needle or a twisted scribe, or simply as an etching needle. And as we scratch away the ground, that exposes the copper underneath. We then place the copper into our acid bath. At Cape Fear, we actually use, instead of an acid, the traditional acids release toxic gases. We actually use chloride, which is a salt solution that does not produce toxic gas. The acid bath, or the ferric chloride bath, will eat away copper where it's exposed. Once the etch has completed, we'll remove the plate from the acid bath, clean everything off, wash off the ground, apply ink, and then wipe the ink down, and that'll put the ink down into the grooves that were created by the acid bath or the ferric chloride bath. So here's an etching by Rembrandt, and you can see that the etching kind of combines two aspects. It can have very regular, even mark making like we saw with engraving. It can have more hesitant or sketchy mark making like we saw with dry point. But most importantly, it allows us to create different levels of dark because we can etch more than once, and so we can make some lines etched deeper than others. We can make some areas etched deeper than others. Values. By far the most complicated of the intaglio acid-based techniques is aquatint, and with aquatint, essentially what we're doing is spreading a resin across the surface as in a ground powder form. And so it is applied basically as sort of sprinkles or dots all over the entire surface. It's bonded to the surface of the plate. Areas are then stopped out with the ground to prevent acid from eating away at them, and then the plate is exposed to the acid bath for a brief time. It's removed, more areas are blocked with the ground, and it's etched again. So areas that are exposed twice etch to a deeper value, and we just keep doing that. We etch some areas, block more, etch, block, until we've achieved the range of values that we're interested with. You can see here that there are some areas that are pure white, some areas that are light gray, middle gray, and dark black. The aquatint almost always has this kind of pebbly appearance, so most people who do aquatint will come back and add lines with a dry point needle or an engraving tool to make the image a little more clear. We also looked at a stencil printmaking technique, screen or screen printing. You can cut the stencil by hand. That's the traditional way of doing things. But of course, nowadays we use the emulsion technique. We coat the screen with a photosensitive emulsion. We apply the artwork as what we call a positive. It's a transparent sheet of plastic with the image in jet black where we want the ink to be. We apply that positive to the light, and that creates an interesting chemical effect. Wherever the light can touch the emulsion, it hardens the emulsion. Where it's blocked by the artwork, the emulsion stays soft, so we can spray it out, creating a stencil in the screen. Then we can put ink into the screen and use a squeegee to pass the ink through and print it onto a variety of surfaces, including t-shirts. Lithography is another print form that we discussed. It is traditionally done on limestone. So litho literally means stone. So it's easy to remember. Litho and limestone both start with L. The concept is really kind of intriguing. The idea of lithography was almost discovered by accident. Anything that has a greasy content will start to slightly etch away at a fairly microscopic level to the surface of a limestone plate. And so drawing with grease-based materials, you actually are etching the image right into the plate. You can't feel it with your finger, you can't really see it with the naked eye. It happens on an almost microscopic level, so we call this a planographic technique because it seems as though there's almost no change to the surface at all. Normally the drawing is applied, we help the etch along a little bit by coating the stone in a layer of gum arabic that has some acid mixed into it. We let that sit for a little while, then clean the whole thing off, and as long as you keep the stone wet, it does something kind of magical. The water rolls away the areas where the greasy drawing material used to be. And of course the water repels the oil-based ink that you roll across it. You can see the artist top left is rolling an oil-based ink onto his stone. So the water repels the oil is attracted to where the greasy drawing material can imitate almost any other drawing or painting technique that you can think of. It can look like watercolor, it can look like charcoal or pen and ink work, and it was the dominant form of printing for many years. The monotype, and its name kind of gives you a hint, mono means one. Monotype is a technique of making an image where we're not making a series of identical copies. With a monotype, you're freehand manipulating the ink. You might be adding ink to a surface, you might be scraping ink away, you might be putting a thin layer down and then using a texture to pick up ink. Whatever technique you're doing, though, you're only able to make one exact copy of the image that you're making. There's no matrix, you're just freehand manipulating the ink on a copper or glass plate. Collograph is kind of a unique printing technique. It sounds like a technique already studied, collage. And that's in fact what it is. We're making low relief images by cutting and gluing and pasting things to a soft material. We can then apply ink either with a roller, as in the example at the top, or scraping and wiping, as you see the artist doing the image at the far right. So we can create either relief inking appearance or intaglio appearance, or actually we can create a combination of both of those effects. So collograph is like a collage form of printing. When we're doing multiple colors, usually, traditionally, you use a different plate for each individual color, and the last plate that prints, which is traditionally in black and has the outlines, details, is referred to as the key plate. You can see here the key plate printed by itself at the top left, and at the bottom you can see the key plate printed the color plates. Then we turned our attention to photography and film, and the first thing we looked at with photography was the idea of the camera obscura, or dark room. This has nothing to do with the a dark room where film is processed. Instead, it literally is a darkened room. It's a space or box. It could be big enough for someone to be inside of, or it could be smaller. But light is not able to get into this box except through one single controlled opening. And an optical effect happens that creates an upside down, slightly blurry image on the opposite wall of whatever is on the outside of the box. So artists used it as a guide, as an aid in drawing and tracing, but the goal was to try to fix the image, to keep it there. And it took a lot of experimentation. We knew about this visual effect as far back as the 1400s, but it took really until about 1839 to be able to capture the image. I just wanted to show you one more example of the camera obscura fact happening in the real world. In this rundown building with a boarded up window, there's one little dot of light getting through the center of that board, and it creates this incredible reflection on the opposite wall of what's outside of that building. The first patented photography technique, patented in 1839, was named after its inventor, Jacques-Louis Daguerre, so we call it the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype essentially is made using a camera obscura, but inside of that would be a piece of metal coated with silver iodide, and that is the surface that the image would be captured on. As light was exposed onto that image, certain areas of the plate would begin to darken, creating a permanent photograph. Now, you wouldn't be making a negative that you could then print and make copies of. It's a one-shot deal. The daguerreotype also has the drawback of the exposure time be quite long. So you can see in the example in this portrait studio at the top, you can see that the model has his head in a little bit of a clamp from accidentally ruining the photograph by moving too much, because the image would have to be of something very, very still in order for it to work with the daguerreotype. Anything in motion would be kind of ghostly, transparent, or blurred. The next big advance after the daguerreotype is the wet plate technology, and with wet plate, the silver iodide is applied not to a metal plate, as with daguerreotype, but to a sheet of glass. So the image that's burned into it is effectively a negative, which means that it can be used to print onto photographic paper an infinite number of times. And so you see here a traditional wet plate camera. You see wet plates that are ready to be used to print onto paper. And here's a modern portrait made with this technology. So those examples of wet plate photography, those negatives that still exist from the Civil War, can still be reprinted today. The first portrait studio, photographic portrait studio in the US, was opened in New York City. It was owned by Matthew Brady. Brady, Timothy O'Sullivan, and multiple other famous American photographers were employed by the US government to document the American Civil War, and they used wet plate cameras to do this. Of course, the wet plate camera does have a shorter exposure time than daguerreotype, but it's still not fast enough to capture things in motion. So most of the images from the Civil War are images of things in a relatively still state. The next big advance developed by Mr. Eastman was the invention of celluloid film. And so celluloid film, or roll film, you have used in a darkroom situation, if you've ever had darkroom photography experience, is the next big advance. It basically takes the place of the glass plate. But essentially creates an image in negative that can be printed onto photographic paper. So we talked about the uses of photography for a long time. The primary use was for photojournalism, to document, but then also to sell things in terms of advertising and editorial illustration, if you will. We looked at this example in particular, though, as an example that really is its main function, main purpose as photojournalism, but we can talk about the artistic skill that went into taking this photograph, making this composition, and you can clearly see that the photographer here, Dorothea Lange, took multiple shots, multiple different compositions to arrive at the photograph that we recognize as the most iconic image of the Great Depression, the image at the right. But you can see this is the same family here to the left, photographed at the same day, essentially the same photo shoot, so to speak. Probably the most famous American photographer, name that we should definitely recognize, is Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz was sort of the champion of the idea that photography could be a legitimate art form. You have to remember that a lot of people saw it merely as a scientific or mechanical process for making an image. They really, not everyone, but some people saw painting and sculpture as true art forms, and the camera as being sort of a machine that does the work for you. So it did take some forward-thinking people making arguments about artists using technology to make artistic statements and images. And Alfred Stieglitz was really at the forefront of that. He published magazines about photography. He explained or discovered and then shared his information with other photographers. He discovered methods for taking photographs in rain, in fog, at night. He also managed a gallery in New York City called Gallery 291, where he showcased art photography. Were using the camera to create two-dimensional artwork. He also promoted the work of modern abstract painters there, including his eventual wife, Georgia. We also looked at film, the idea of motion pictures. So I wanted you to remember not necessarily every single date by any means, but just to remember that it's really not that old of a technology. We had the first commercial movie theater slightly over 100 years ago. It's kind of crazy to think about. 1895, we're now in 2020, so what, 125 years, give or take? We're looking at the very first commercial movie theater where you could buy a ticket and sit and watch a moving picture. This was opened by the brothers who were the inventors of the projection camera, which would allow you to show film on a screen at the right frame rate so that the image would be in motion. They are the Lumiere brothers, and that's kind of an interesting coincidence. If you know Beauty and the Beast, Lumiere is the name of the character who is the candlestick, so Lumiere actually does mean light, and that's how their invention works. It passes light through the film in order to project the image on the screen. It's kind of interesting. I just wanted us to be aware of some of the most influential directors over the course of the development of cinema or motion pictures in America. So I tried to pick, not based on politics necessarily, but based on the numbers of awards that these particular actors were nominated for and or won over their careers. So if we look at the development of film decade by decade, we could argue that the 1920s, the most successful directors of that early period of black and white silent film would be Charlie Chaplin. He's not only the actor that you see, also, of course, the writer and the director. So he controls all aspects. So silent film star, actor, director, Charlie Chaplin. We saw the invention of color film for motion pictures in the 30s. So 1939 is a year that stands out in a way. Two of the films that were up for Best Picture that year made a lot of use of this intense new technology of color, Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz, which of course has its iconic from black and white to color transition. Through the 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, Alfred Hitchcock was one of the most successful directors working in Hollywood, and we saw him working in collaboration with other filmmakers. We also saw him working with artists. The image at the bottom is from a Hitchcock film dream sequence or hypnosis regression sequence that was designed and animated by Salvador Dali, and it's part of Alfred Hitchcock's film Spell. Also in the 50s and 60s, another prominent and award-winning director was John Huston. This is an example of one of the films he made that was probably one of his most iconic. His dramas often had very heavy emotional messages and social issues. This is the won Humphrey Bogart the Best Actor Award. This is The African Queen. Again, this is somebody who has become problematic culturally, but dominated the awards given from the late 60s into the early 1980s in terms of screen. Also awards for usually leading and supporting actresses. This is the work of Woody Allen. More recognizable to your generation probably is the work dating really from the late 70s, but even through the 2020s, the work of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, the advent of the modern blockbuster, we can kind of put to them. Of course, we could also look at Spielberg's work outside of just movies like Indiana Jones or Jaws. We could also look at his very serious historical dramas, including Schindler's List. Last thing to be looking at really are the different types of shots that are used in motion pictures, movie and TV. You know these inside out and backwards. This would be an example of a full shot. You see your actor, or in this case, computer-generated actor, head to toe. This would be an example of a medium shot, just the head and torso, like head to waist. A close-up, the Joker at the top, the extreme close-up of Magneto, they're just a portion of the face. A long shot is going to show you a really deep space. You might see actors in it, but you're definitely looking at a really, really deep three-dimensional space as well. A long shot essentially shows you a deep image, a landscape. The other terms, though, to know, I just want to jump back here for a quick second. The pan shot and the traveling shot show up on the test. A shot is as if the camera is pivoting like it's on a tripod, like it's in one position and it kind of scans left to right. A traveling shot is much more dynamic. A traveling shot is when the camera is mounted to a track or to a cable and it literally moves through the environment.